What was life like for my grandpa? My grandpa, Mr. Kelvin James Stein, was born in a little rented cottage on Lindsay Street in Hamilton, Newcastle, at 12 noon on the 28th of May 1928, just as the BHP Steelworks whistle was blowing. My grandpa used to say that it was a lucky time in world history to be born, as he was too young to actively participate in World War II, and was then eventually too old to participate in Vietnam. Grandpa was a happy boy growing up in Newcastle. He did well in school and loved mathematics. He got his first job delivering Christmas telegrams at the Hamilton post office. As a child, Grandpa was told by his parents that he must pronounce his surname as Steen and not the correct German pronunciation, Stein. This was because Grandpa's aunts and her siblings came home from school in tears one day because they had been harassed by the other children for having a German name. The story goes that his grandmother decided that they would forever use the English pronunciation Steen, as when two vowels are together in English, the first one is pronounced. To this day, the family name remains pronounced as Steen, but is still written traditionally. While the family had indeed emigrated from Germany back in 1849, they had established a life in Camden and Maitland, and had been Australian for many generations. Grandpa spent a regular and uneventful 3.5 years at high school during the war years and successfully passed the intermediate certificate at the end of the 3rd year. He then went on to the 4th year, but only until he had turned 15 and was old enough to leave. Grandpa's grandfather, James Edward William Stein, was the biggest influence on his ultimate career choice, as, like him, he had always wanted to work in an office. Jobs were hard to come by, but he was lucky to be hired as a junior clerk in the workshop store of J&A Brown and Aberman Seaham Collieries Limited on the 28th of June 1943. Here coal mining machinery was repaired and diesel boats were built for the US Army for use in the Pacific area during the war. Later in his career, Grandpa had a large influence on the company's mergers, its railway connections, and later their business endeavours. Throughout his 42-year tenure, he eventually retired as the Assistant Chief General Manager of Coal and Allied. In 1944, Grandpa was enrolled in the evening classes of Newcastle Business College to undertake a typing course for his role. The college held an annual Christmas party and dance, and it was at this event in December of 1944 where Grandpa first met the love of his life, Betty Andrews. After an 18th-month courtship, they became engaged, and 18 months after that, were married at St. Peter's Anglican Church at Hamilton. Grandpa began playing baseball in 1946 and fell in love with the game. He encouraged my dad and uncle to play, and in due course, my brothers and I, and many cousins, all enjoyed playing in our younger years. This is footage of my father playing, and was shot by my grandpa on his trusty old Kodak Standard 8, which he bought in the 1960s. Nana and Grandpa would later move to Sydney with his work and became Sydney gypsies, boarding, living in tiny apartments, and moving every few months or years before finally buying a brick and tile bungalow in Willoughby, North Sydney in 1953. Once here, they had 2 sons, Peter and Mark, and a daughter, Wendy. In 1962, they all moved to a much bigger new home in St. Ives, which is where he lived until his death in February 2015. He was 87 years old. Grandpa passed away on the day my wife Jenna and I learned that we were pregnant, and while he will never meet our son, I believe they are connected in some way. My grandpa had some fascinating stories of his love of my Nana, their travels together, his fondness of baseball, his camera, and his work. He had an active part in all of his 8 grandchildren's lives. He had some tough times and some ups and downs, but overall, I'd have to say that life was pretty good to old Kelvin Stein. I love you and miss you, Grandpa.